For decades, the world's most brilliant professors had argued over a problem so complex it destroyed careers, drained research budgets, and divided academic institutions across continents. Entire conferences were built around it. Tenured scholars retired without answers. Doctoral students abandoned mathematics and physics altogether after failing to even approach it. Then one ordinary afternoon, in a neglected public school known more for metal detectors than academic trophies, a black schoolboy casually claimed he could solve it. His words didn't spark curiosity. They triggered laughter. What followed was ridicule, disbelief, and quiet cruelty masked as professionalism. No one imagined that this boy, dismissed before he finished his sentence, would soon force the academic world to confront its deepest prejudices. And when the truth finally emerged, it didn't just rewrite textbooks. It exposed a system built to ignore minds that didn't look the part. Before the story unfolds, make sure you like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel Black Voice Stories, because stories like this deserve to be heard. The school stood at the edge of the city where opportunity thinned, with every cracked sidewalk. Its windows were reinforced with wire mesh, not for weather, but for safety. Generations of students had passed through its halls carrying more survival instincts than academic confidence. Teachers rotated frequently, funding evaporated annually, and expectations were set painfully low. The building itself seemed resigned to mediocrity, as though excellence had never been invited inside. Among the hundreds of students navigating overcrowded classrooms and outdated textbooks was a quiet boy named Isaiah Carter. He didn't stand out physically. He wasn't disruptive, charismatic, or particularly social. What made him invisible was how easily he fit into the assumptions surrounding him. Black, poor neighborhood, public school, average student. Or so it seemed. Isaiah sat near the back of most classrooms, not out of defiance but habit. He observed more than he spoke. When teachers asked questions, he usually looked down, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he had learned early that speaking up invited attention he didn't want. Attention often came with suspicion, or worse, mockery. What no one noticed was how quickly his eyes moved when equations appeared on the board, how his pencil barely touched paper during tests, how he finished assignments early and spent the remaining time filling notebooks with symbols that weren't part of any curriculum. His notebooks weren't filled with doodles or lyrics. They were dense with formulas, recursive patterns, and theoretical models copied from library books far beyond his grade level. Isaiah's fascination began years earlier, when his mother worked nights and left him alone with borrowed books from the city library. Without internet access or tutoring, he taught himself from textbooks that others had discarded. He didn't know the names of prestigious universities or famous scholars. He only knew the beauty of numbers and the strange comfort they gave him. Numbers were fair. They didn't judge. They didn't doubt his right to exist in their world. At school, advanced programs were reserved for students from feeder neighborhoods. Isaiah's school didn't even offer calculus. When standardized tests came back, his scores were flagged repeatedly, but administrators assumed errors. A quiet meeting here, a recheck there, and then silence. No follow-up, no opportunity. It was easier to believe the system than challenge it. Everything changed during a rare collaboration between the school and a nearby university. Professors volunteered to give enrichment lectures, partly as outreach, partly as resume padding. One afternoon, a visiting academic presented a simplified version of a long-debated theoretical problem, one that had remained unresolved for decades. It was framed as an unsolved question, a monument to human limitation. As the professor spoke, most students tuned out. The concepts flew far above their exposure. But Isaiah listened with unsettling intensity. His posture straightened. His eyes narrowed. Something clicked, not with confusion, but recognition. When the lecture ended, students were encouraged to ask questions. Silence followed. The professor smiled politely, accustomed to indifference. Then Isaiah raised his hand. He didn't ask a question. He said he thought he could solve it. The room reacted instantly, not with curiosity, but amusement. Laughter rippled through the seats. A few students turned to look, some smirking, others embarrassed for him. The professor paused, surprised more by the audacity than the claim itself. It was meant to be a teachable moment, a gentle dismissal. But the damage was already done. Isaiah had spoken. Word spread quickly, not about brilliance, but about arrogance. A boy from a struggling school claiming insight into a problem that had defeated Nobel-level minds became an inside joke. Teachers whispered. Students mocked. Even administrators chuckled behind closed doors, framing it as youthful imagination rather than intellectual curiosity. The professor returned to university and mentioned the incident casually to colleagues. Laughter followed there, too. It was easier to laugh and reflect on why a child would feel confident enough to make such a claim. But Isaiah didn't retreat. Instead, he withdrew further into his work. He revisited the problem obsessively, reconstructing it from memory. He filled pages with derivations, cross-referencing concepts he had absorbed independently. Without mentors or validation, he relied entirely on logic. Weeks passed. The ridicule faded, replaced by indifference. That was worse. Then something unusual happened. Isaiah submitted a written explanation to his math teacher, not as homework, but as proof. The teacher skimmed it, confused by symbols she didn't recognize. She assumed plagiarism. The paper was returned without comment. Undeterred, Isaiah rewrote it. Then again, each time refining clarity, simplifying assumptions, tightening logic. Eventually, the stack of papers grew thick enough to scare him. He knew enough now to realize what he was attempting mattered. He mailed copies to the university department using an address found online. No response came. Months passed. The academic year ended. Isaiah advanced grades without recognition, his potential still buried beneath lowered expectations. Then one afternoon, an envelope arrived at the school addressed to principal. Inside was a request for a meeting regarding a submission that had triggered intense internal debate. The tone was cautious, curious, concerned. The university had noticed inconsistencies, not in logic, but in authorship. They didn't believe the work came from a high school student. They suspected fraud. Isaiah was summoned to the office. The atmosphere was tense, accusatory. Questions were asked indirectly. Where did he get help? Who coached him? Which adult assisted? His answers were simple. No one. The administrators exchanged looks. They contacted the university. A formal review was initiated. Professors dissected the work line by line, expecting collapse. Instead, they found elegance, original framing, a solution pathway no one had tried, not because it was hidden, but because it didn't align with established thinking. Resistance followed immediately. Some argued coincidence. Others suggested computational luck. A few dismissed it outright, unable to accept that insight could emerge from outside elite institutions. But mathematics doesn't bend to ego. The solution held. When Isaiah was invited to present his reasoning, the room filled with tension. He stood alone at the front, surrounded by credentials that dwarfed his existence. He spoke calmly, methodically, explaining each step without bravado. No one interrupted. By the time he finished, the laughter had disappeared. In its place was something far more uncomfortable. Silence. The silence wasn't admiration. It was fear. Fear of what the solution implied. Fear of what they had ignored. Fear of what systems had failed to nurture. A senior professor finally spoke, not with praise, but caution. Peer review would be required. Verification. Replication. Standards must be upheld. All reasonable demands. Yet the urgency behind them felt defensive. As news leaked, the narrative shifted. Headlines framed Isaiah as a prodigy, but qualifiers crept in. Unexpected. Unlikely. Rare. Words designed to isolate him as an exception rather than evidence of systemic oversight. Online debates erupted. Some celebrated him. Others questioned his legitimacy. Racist undertones surfaced, thinly veiled as skepticism. Accusations of assistance followed him everywhere. Isaiah remained quiet through it all. He returned to school, where reactions were split between pride and resentment. Teachers who once dismissed him now avoided eye contact. Administrators posed for photos. The final confirmation came months later, when independent teams validated the solution. Journals prepared publication. Conferences requested appearances. The problem was no longer unsolved. It had been solved by a boy they laughed at. The emotional weight finally hit Isaiah when he stood alone one evening, realizing how close the world had come to never knowing, how easily his work could have been buried, how many others like him had been. This wasn't just his victory. It was an indictment. Isaiah's story forced institutions to confront uncomfortable truths. Talent had never been scarce. Opportunity had. The academic world began discussing access, bias, and gatekeeping, not out of goodwill but necessity. Scholarship programs emerged. Outreach initiatives expanded. But Isaiah knew real change would take more than headlines. He chose to speak, not in debates, but in actions. He mentored students like himself. He advocated for recognition without permission. He refused to be framed as an anomaly. His solution entered textbooks. His name followed. But the greatest impact wasn't mathematical. It was human. Because every time someone hears this story, they're forced to ask a dangerous question. How many minds have we laughed away? And how many truths are still waiting in the back of the room, hand raised, ignored? If this story moved you, challenge the system with us. Like the video, share it forward, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Black Voice Stories, where untold truths finally get the spotlight.